This video is brought to you by Ground News. Over the last few days, US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy have had a pretty public falling out, with Trump calling Zelenskyy a dictator and Zelenskyy accusing Trump of living in a Russian disinformation space. Until recently, it was widely assumed that this was a consequence of the meeting between American and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia earlier this week. But while that meeting obviously didn't help, in the last few days there has been some suggestion that quite a lot of Trump and Zelenskyy's falling out has actually been about a prospective mineral deal that would see the US get preferential access to Ukraine's mineral reserves. On Thursday, Axios claimed that the US and Ukraine fell out after Zelenskyy refused to sign the original deal. And a few hours later, Mike Waltz, America's national security advisor, publicly urged Volodymyr Zelenskyy to take, quote, a hard look at a proposed deal. So in this video, we're going to look at this proposed mineral deal, why it's proved so controversial, and what might happen next. Could you rank every single politician in the world? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. First though, what mineral resources does Ukraine actually have? Well, according to Ukraine's own geological survey, Ukraine has large underground deposits of certain in-demand metals, including titanium, graphite, lithium and uranium, as well as a handful of rare earth reserves, with all these deposits generally occurring along the so-called Ukrainian Shield, a strip of land that runs along the right bank of the Dnipro River. However, these deposits have not undergone any significant exploration or development. For instance, Ukrainian officials claim some of the world's largest deposits of titanium, used for missiles, planes and ships, but only 10% of its proven reserves are being developed. So why haven't these reserves been developed? Well, it's at least in part because, during the Soviet and much of the post-Soviet era, Ukraine didn't receive enough investment. Then, in the 2010s, when Ukraine began drawing up plans for it, offering outside investors tax breaks and investment rights, including a major oil and gas privatization effort in 2013, these efforts were interrupted by Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Then, in 2017, Ukraine launched a new energy strategy to accelerate the licensing of mineral extractions. But Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 again got in the way. Anyway, Ukraine's unexplored mineral wealth has apparently drawn Trump's attention, and Ukraine and the US are now negotiating some sort of deal that would give American companies privileged access to these deposits. The New York Times actually reported that Ukraine actually refused to sign a mining deal with Biden, so they could use it as leverage over Trump, and originally it looked like this strategy had worked. Earlier this month, Trump seemed to imply that he'd be happy to continue supporting Ukraine in exchange for access to its mineral wealth, saying, quote, they're going to secure what we're giving them with their rare earths and other things, and that he expected $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals. Trump's enthusiasm for rare earths specifically is probably related to his anxieties about China. Rare earths are used in a whole load of advanced technologies, but China currently accounts for about 60% of all rare earth mining and about 90% of rare earth processing. However, it seems like the deal collapsed on Wednesday last week, when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent visited Kyiv to sign it off, apparently because Zelenskyy decided it was too one-sided to get through the Ukrainian parliament, and was disappointed that it wasn't accompanied by any US security guarantees. This would be consistent with a slightly astonishing report from The Telegraph earlier this week, who published parts of the original draft agreement. According to that draft agreement, the US would get 50% of recurring revenues received by Ukraine from extraction of resources, and 50% of the financial value of all new licenses issued to third parties until it had received $500 billion, way more than the $175 billion the US has so far spent on Ukraine. But this agreement wouldn't just cover metal reserves, it also covered oil and gas, ports, and, quote, other infrastructure as agreed. The US would also get to decide who got those licenses and the terms of any future projects, with the draft also stating that, quote, the agreement shall be governed by New York law, without regard to conflict of laws principles, and that the government of Ukraine waives sovereign immunity with respect to its liability. In short, the US basically gets to control all of Ukraine's extractable mineral wealth and any infrastructure until the country has paid back roughly 3 times what the US has spent in aid, which is why the Telegraph describes it as, quote, the economic colonization of Ukraine in legal perpetuity. Perhaps more importantly, though, it's not clear Ukraine would ever be able to pay off $500 billion, for the simple reason that, while Ukraine has clearly done a great job in advertising its mineral wealth to Trump, there's a fair bit of uncertainty about how much mineral wealth Ukraine actually has. You hear massive numbers being bandied around at the moment. Trump claimed Ukraine had $500 billion in rare earths alone. The New York Times put Ukraine's total mineral wealth at $11.5 trillion, while the Washington Post put it at an astonishing $26 trillion. But to be totally honest, none of these numbers seem remotely plausible. While it's true that Ukraine has pretty substantial lithium and titanium reserves, neither of these metals are really that expensive. The price of lithium has fallen by more than 80% in the past 2 years, for instance. It's not even clear Ukraine is that well endowed when it comes to rare earths. While the Ukrainian Geological Survey claims some rare earth deposits in Ukraine, the US Geological Survey doesn't list Ukraine as having any reserves of the 15 key rare earth elements. In fact, the former director of the Ukraine Geological Survey said recently that there has been no modern assessment of rare earth reserves in Ukraine, and estimates were based on old Soviet-era studies. This speaks to a more general truth about rare earths. Contrary to what the name suggests, they're not actually that rare geologically. The issue is mainly that their extraction is severely polluting, and their value is massively overhyped. According to Bloomberg's Javier Blas, the value of all the world's rare earth production at best rounds to $15 billion a year, a fraction of the value of annual global oil or copper output. To reach the $500 billion mooted by Trump, the US would need to secure 150 plus years of Ukrainian output. So, if Ukraine doesn't really have trillions of dollars of mineral wealth, what's Zelenskyy doing talking it up? Well, some Ukrainian officials have come out to say that Zelenskyy talked up Ukraine's mineral riches to curry favour with Trump, but also in an attempt to draw American companies and capital into Ukraine, which would give Trump an incentive to take Ukraine's security more seriously. Whether this strategy works or ends up with Ukraine turning into an American economic colony remains uncertain. Either way, this all demonstrates a transactional attitude towards alliances under Trump, which doesn't bode well for Ukraine. As this whole rare earth saga demonstrates, following along with the news is pretty difficult in the current landscape. We're increasingly being flooded by misleading content, algorithmic feeds that just back up our biases, and reductions in fact-checking efforts. It almost feels like people are intentionally making it harder to get to the truth. One way you can cut through the noise is with Ground News, a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, here's a story about JD Vance warning Zelenskyy against bad-mouthing Trump. Right away, you can see that the story had at least 33 outlets reporting on it. 31% lean left, while 50% lean right. Every story also comes with a detailed view of the bias distribution, factuality scores, and even specific ownership information, so you can see how reliable the reporting actually is. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to reveal that the left was more likely than the right to report Zelenskyy calling on Trump to be more truthful, and noting that Trump operates in a disinformation space. But my favourite part has to be their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being underreported on one side of the political spectrum or the other. This not only helps you redress your personal news bias by reading stories you might otherwise have missed, but also gives you a better perspective on how the media ecosystem is being manipulated and shifted to fit political objectives. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape. cutting through opinion and noise with a feed free from manipulation or algorithms. And I can't recommend it enough. In fact, if you subscribe today, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's under $5 a month for unlimited access to every incredible Ground News feature. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.